April 1945. A bombed-out intersection in Nuremberg, Germany. A heavy convoy of American supply trucks laden with food and medical supplies sits at a sudden, grinding halt. In the middle of the shattered roadway, a defiant barricade of concrete rubble blocks the advance. Standing atop the debris, a group of radicalized teenagers hurls heavy, jagged stones directly at the vehicles. A jagged rock smashes through a lead windshield, spraying sharp glass and drawing immediate blood from an American soldier. The teenagers chant fanatical slogans, positioning themselves boldly in the road, because they know Allied troops have strict orders not to shoot unarmed youths. They believe their age shields them from the consequences of their violence, leaving the convoy trapped and defenseless. But General George S. Patton is currently on his way to this exact intersection. He will deliver a ruthless, hands-on lesson that turns their own barricade into their worst nightmare. This is the story of what Patton did when German youths threw stones at American supply trucks. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. Corporal Henry Dawson was 21 years old. He came from a dairy farm in Wisconsin, where he grew up milking cows before the draft board called his name. Now, he was a transport driver for the Red Ball Express, pushing heavy trucks through ruined European territory. He had spent months staring at mud, broken asphalt, and the backs of supply vehicles. He had seen the charred remains of Bastogne and lost his closest childhood friend to an artillery shell just 3 weeks prior. That loss left him quiet, hollowed out, and utterly exhausted. He did his job without complaint, believing that every mile driven brought him closer to home. On this afternoon, his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly. His knuckles turned white, while blood dripped slowly down his chin from a jagged gash caused by flying glass. Standing directly opposite him was Erich Müller. He was 16 years old, a fanatical Hitler youth leader from Nuremberg, who refused to accept the reality of his nation's imminent defeat. He stood on top of the pile of broken concrete, wearing a perfectly pressed, though slightly dusty, uniform complete with a crisp swastika armband. Erich had spent his entire adolescence in party academies, completely brainwashed by propaganda. He firmly believed he was a supreme Aryan warrior, destined to defend the fatherland from foreign invaders. To him, the visible restraint of the American soldiers was not a sign of humanity, but proof of democratic weakness and cowardice. He held a heavy stone in his right hand, his face twisted into a sneer, entirely confident that his age made him untouchable to the enemy forces. By the spring of 1945, the Allied advance into the heart of Germany had completely fractured the infrastructure of the Third Reich. Cities were reduced to smoldering craters. The national government had effectively ceased to function, and the civilian population faced widespread starvation. In the midst of this absolute chaos, the Red Ball Express became the lifeblood for both advancing troops and desperate civilians, pushing massive convoys through ruined territories to deliver food, fuel, and medical supplies. Occupation forces encountered an increasingly complex security environment where regular military units had vanished, leaving behind isolated pockets of fanatical resistance, displaced persons, and radicalized civilians who refused to accept defeat. Many American commanders, wary of causing further civilian casualties or violating strict military directives regarding non-combatants, often allowed minor acts of local hostility to slide. Officers frequently ordered their drivers to simply look the other way, absorb small insults, or detoured around troubled neighborhoods, rather than engage with hostile populations. This administrative leniency, meant to maintain order, instead created a dangerous vacuum where civilian agitators felt increasingly emboldened to disrupt vital supply operations. They mistook professional military restraint for systematic institutional weakness, assuming the Western Allies lacked the stomach for harsh enforcement. The breakdown of civil authority meant that a single blocked intersection could jeopardize the survival of thousands of people in nearby distribution zones. Convoys could not afford delays, yet frontline units remained hesitant to use lethal force against citizens who did not carry conventional military weapons. This specific policy of restraint led directly to the standoff at the Nuremberg intersection, where a vital delivery of humanitarian aid was completely immobilized by a handful of aggressive teenagers. An American officer walked toward the barricade with his hands completely empty. Captain Arthur Vance, a 32-year-old company commander from Columbus, Ohio, stopped 10 feet from the pile of rubble. He looked up at the teenagers. He kept his voice level and steady. He told them that this convoy was carrying medical supplies and food for civilians. He ordered them to step down and clear the road immediately. Erich Muller did not move. He spat on the ground near the officer's boots. He told the captain that German ground belonged only to German warriors. He said that foreign invaders had no right to pass through the city. He raised a heavy stone to emphasize his point. Captain Vance cited military regulations. He explained that blocking a humanitarian convoy was a severe violation under occupation law. He told the teenager that his actions were endangering the lives of his own people in the neighboring sectors. He warned him that continued resistance would result in immediate detention by military police. Erich laughed loudly. He shouted that his allegiance belonged entirely to the Führer and the Reich. He yelled that he did not recognize the laws of a weak, democratic army. He said that the Americans were cowards who hid behind rules because they were too afraid to fight real soldiers. He looked at his followers and pointed at Corporal Dawson's bleeding face. He told them that the supreme Aryan race would never surrender to merchants and farmers. He then hurled another heavy stone that smashed directly into the metal frame of the second truck. The surrounding teenagers cheered and began chanting party slogans louder. They threw a fresh volley of rocks that forced the nearby drivers to duck inside their cabs for cover. Captain Vance realized that words would not change the situation. He saw the deep fanaticism in the boys' eyes and knew that normal procedures were completely useless. He stepped back toward his command vehicle. He picked up his radio microphone and contacted headquarters. He reported that a hostile partisan group had immobilized the supply line and injured personnel. He stated that the confrontation had reached a dangerous deadlock that required higher authority. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the intersection. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and his ivory-handled revolvers rested against his belt. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked forward with a calm, deliberate stride. The shouting stopped instantly. The drivers straightened their backs, and the military police saluted. The general looked at the bleeding face of Corporal Dawson, then turned his gaze toward the barricade. He did not raise his voice. The air became completely silent. Patton studied the boy. He asked, "Who was in charge of this gathering?" Erich Muller stepped forward, puffing out his chest, and stated his name and position. Patton asked if he was the one who had ordered the throwing of stones at United States military personnel. Erich replied that he had. Patton asked if he understood that these trucks were carrying food meant for starving people. Erich answered that he did not care about supplies from enemies. Patton spoke quietly. He said that the young man believed he was acting like a brave soldier defending his home. He noted that the boy thought his uniform and his slogans gave him the right to attack men who were under orders to show restraint. He looked at the perfectly pressed swastika armband on the teenager's sleeve. He said that real soldiers did not hide behind their youth or use the mercy of their enemy as a shield while throwing rocks from safety. He pointed at Corporal Dawson. He said that driver had crossed an ocean and worked through blood and mud to bring order back to a broken continent. He told Erich that true warriors faced their tasks with their bare hands when required, instead of relying on unearned privilege and arrogance. He stated that the rubble on the ground belonged to a collapsed empire that was finished. He gave the teenagers a single choice. He told them they would either use their hands to clear every single piece of concrete from the intersection immediately, or they would be turned over to the military tribunal as common saboteurs. He said there would be no arguments, no delays, and no negotiations. Erich stared at the general, his face turning pale as his unearned confidence completely evaporated under that cold, steady gaze. The young leader lowered his head and walked toward the first pile of stone. The military police stepped forward and formed a tight perimeter around the intersection, with their rifles kept at the ready. Under the watchful eyes of the armed guard, Erich Müller and his followers were forced to begin the grueling work of clearing the massive barricade piece by piece. The teenagers worked without tools, without gloves, and under a scorching midday sun. Erich picked up a jagged chunk of fractured concrete, the rough surface scraping hard against his soft skin. The air was thick with gray plaster dust and the sharp smell of gasoline fumes from the idling supply trucks. Within 40 minutes, the superficial arrogance completely vanished from the group. The fine cloth of Erich's perfectly pressed uniform became stained with sweat and white masonry dust, and his polished boots were covered in grime. 2 hours into the backbreaking labor, his hands were entirely covered in painful, oozing blisters that began to tear and bleed against the heavy stones. He stopped for a brief moment and complained loudly about the severe physical pain to a guard. Patton looked down coldly from his position and told him that the fatherland required sacrifice before ordering him to keep digging. The nearby drivers and local civilians watched in absolute silence as the young fanatics cleared the path. Corporal Henry Dawson returned to Wisconsin in the late autumn of 1945. He went back to his family dairy farm, though his hands shook whenever he started the tractor engine. The gash on his face healed into a thin white scar that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He married his childhood sweetheart in 1947, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about the war to anyone in his town. He spent his days in the quiet routine of the pastures, trying to forget the sound of shattering glass and fanatical chanting. He lived a long, unassuming life on the farm, dying quietly in his sleep in August of 1992. Erich Müller spent 3 years in an Allied denazification camp before being released into a reconstructed Germany in 1948. The unearned privilege of his youth was completely gone, replaced by the grim reality of a defeated nation. He eventually found work as a manual laborer in a Munich brickyard, his permanently scarred and calloused hands a daily reminder of his hours at the Nuremberg intersection. He lived a highly solitary life, completely detached from politics, and died in near obscurity in 1984, without ever recanting his past beliefs to his few acquaintances. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident with the rock-throwing teenagers in his public statements or his official press briefings. He did, however, recount the confrontation in a private letter written to his wife, Beatrice, just 1 week after the intersection was cleared. He wrote that the greatest danger in Germany was not the broken buildings, but the poisoned minds of the younger generation, who had been fed on nothing but lies and unearned arrogance. He noted that a few hours of hard, honest labor with their bare hands did more to break their fanatical illusions than any stack of military regulations or political speeches ever could. Some historians have argued that General Patton's handling of the stone-throwing youth was an unnecessarily harsh measure applied to a group of impressionable teenagers who had been thoroughly manipulated by state propaganda. They contend that a more conventional administrative reprimand or a temporary detention would have been more appropriate for civilian minors under international occupation guidelines. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that his decisive action prevented local resistance from escalating into a dangerous partisan movement during a critical phase of the Allied advance. They suggest that the immediate, hands-on lesson dismantled their fanatical illusions quickly and effectively without resorting to lethal force. What is certain is that the intersection was cleared entirely without further bloodshed, and the vital humanitarian convoy reached its destination without any additional delays. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have chosen to simply arrest them and move on? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they had done, make sure to subscribe.